You think you know where trees come from. Of course you do. You've seen it 1,000 times. You push a seed into dirt, add water, wait, and eventually something green breaks through the surface and starts reaching upward. Trees come from the ground. Everyone knows this. It's not even a question worth asking. Except it is. Because here's what nobody ever stops to think about. A mature oak tree weighs around 10,000 pounds. Some trees weigh significantly more. That's thousands of pounds of wood, bark, roots, and branches that didn't exist a century ago. And now it does. So here's the question. Where did all that mass come from? Not vaguely, not poetically, physically. Where did those 10,000 pounds of solid matter come from? The obvious answer is the soil. Roots go deep, the tree pulls stuff up, and that stuff becomes tree. That feels right. That feels obvious. So let's test it. There's a famous experiment done by a Flemish scientist named Jan Baptist van Helmont in the 1600s. He took a willow tree weighing 5 pounds and planted it in 200 pounds of dried soil. He watered it for 5 years and let it grow. At the end, the tree weighed 169 pounds. It had gained 164 pounds of new mass. Then he dried the soil again and weighed it. The soil had lost less than 2 ounces. 2 ounces. The tree gained 164 pounds and the soil barely changed. So where did the other 163 pounds and 14 ounces come from? Not the soil. That's gone. That's the comfortable answer, and the numbers just killed it. This is the moment most people shrug and move on. They figure there's some technical explanation they don't understand, something about nutrients or chemistry, and they file it away and forget it. But stop. Don't move on, because what just happened is extraordinary. You watched 164 pounds of solid physical matter appear out of essentially nothing, and you have no idea where it came from. That's not a small gap in your knowledge. That's a gaping hole in your understanding of how the physical world works. And the answer, when you actually see it, is going to break something in how you think about trees, about air, about matter itself. Let me show you. Okay, so the soil doesn't account for it. But water does, right? The tree drinks water constantly, gallons and gallons of it. A large oak pulls up roughly 100 gallons of water on a hot day. Over a century, that's an enormous amount of water moving through the system. So the mass must come from water. That's the next obvious answer. And it feels even more satisfying than soil because you can actually picture it. Roots drink, water travels up, tree grows. Clean, simple, logical. Except it doesn't work either. Here's why. Water is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. When a tree processes water, it breaks it apart and uses the hydrogen. The oxygen gets released back into the air, which is actually where all the oxygen you're breathing right now comes from. But hydrogen is the lightest element that exists. You need an enormous amount of it to account for any significant mass. And beyond that, wood isn't made of hydrogen. Wood is made of carbon. Carbon is the backbone of every organic molecule, every cell wall, every fiber of every tree that has ever grown. Carbon is heavy, carbon is dense, and carbon makes up roughly 50% of the dry weight of any tree. So here's the problem. The soil doesn't have enough of it. The water doesn't either. A tree's roots absorb minerals from the soil, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and those matter for biological function. But all of those minerals together account for maybe 1 to 2% of the tree's total dry mass. 1 to 2%. The vast majority of what a tree is made of cannot be explained by anything coming out of the ground. The math simply doesn't work, and it doesn't matter how many times you picture roots drinking water, the numbers refuse to cooperate. So you're left with a problem that should feel genuinely uncomfortable. You have a 10,000-pound object sitting in front of you. You know it grew from a 5-ounce seed, and you cannot account for the mass. Not from soil, not from water, not from anything you can see going into the ground. The answer is somewhere else entirely. Somewhere most people never think to look. And when you find out where, it's going to make you look at every tree you've ever seen in a completely different way. The mass comes from air. That's it. That's the answer. Not soil, not water, not minerals, not anything you can hold in your hand or see going into the ground. Almost the entire physical mass of a tree, the trunk, the bark, the roots, the branches, all of it comes from an invisible gas floating in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, CO2, the stuff you exhale, the stuff that makes up 0.04% of the air around you right now. That is what trees are made of. A 10,000-pound oak is, in the most literal physical sense, solidified air. When Van Helmont ran his experiment and couldn't find where the mass went, the answer was floating right in front of his face the entire time. He just couldn't see it because it was invisible. Here's what's actually happening. Trees pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through tiny pores in their leaves called stomata. The CO2 flows in. The tree breaks it apart. It strips the carbon out of that molecule and uses it as raw building material, chaining carbon atoms together into long, complex molecules. And those molecules become everything: glucose, cellulose, lignin, the rigid fibers of wood itself. The oxygen that's left over after the carbon gets stripped out gets released back into the air, which again is where your oxygen comes from. The tree is essentially running a disassembly line on thin air, pulling invisible molecules apart, keeping the carbon and throwing the oxygen back out. And that carbon becomes wood. Solid, dense, physical wood that you can touch and cut and burn. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual molecular mechanism. For a second, just stop and sit with what that means. Every plank of wood in every house ever built started as a gas. Every wooden table, every ship, every forest, every piece of paper you've ever touched was once invisible CO2 drifting through the atmosphere. Trees are machines that reach into the air and pull matter out of it and stack it into solid form, using nothing but sunlight as the energy source. Van Helmont was right to be confused. He just didn't think to weigh the air. And honestly, why would he? The idea that something solid comes from something invisible violates every intuition you have about how matter works. But that's exactly what's happening. Every tree you've ever seen is crystallized atmosphere. Let that land. Then let me show you how. You learned the word photosynthesis in school. You probably remember something about sunlight and chlorophyll and oxygen. You passed the test and moved on. But you were never shown what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is one of the most extraordinary physical processes in the known universe. Let's go through it properly. Sunlight hits a leaf. Now that sunlight is not just warmth or brightness. It is electromagnetic radiation, oscillating electromagnetic fields, traveling at 300 million meters per second, the same fundamental force that holds your atoms together, the same force behind magnets, electricity, and chemistry. When those electromagnetic waves hit a chlorophyll molecule inside a leaf's cell, something remarkable happens. The energy from the light gets absorbed by an electron in the chlorophyll molecule, kicking that electron into a higher energy state. That energized electron then gets passed along a chain of molecules called the electron transport chain. And as it moves, it powers the construction of ATP, which is the energy currency cells use to do work. That's the light reaction. Energy captured from electromagnetic radiation and stored in chemical form. Now the plant uses that stored energy to do something almost unbelievable. It takes CO2, a molecule that is completely stable and has no interest in being broken apart, and it forces it open. It strips the carbon out and uses that carbon to build glucose, a simple sugar with the formula C6H12O6, 6 carbon atoms chained together with hydrogen and oxygen attached. That glucose is the first solid thing in this whole process. The first moment where invisible atmospheric gas becomes an actual physical molecule the tree can use. Then the tree takes that glucose and does something even more impressive. It chains thousands of glucose molecules together into long repeating strands called cellulose, which is the primary structural material in plant cell walls, and into lignin, which fills the spaces between cells and gives wood its hardness and rigidity. Cellulose and lignin are what wood actually is, and the chemical bonds holding all of those molecules together, the bonds between every carbon atom in every strand of cellulose, in every tree, in every forest on Earth, those bonds are electromagnetic. The same force, always the same force. Sunlight, electromagnetic radiation, hits a leaf. The energy gets captured and used to forge electromagnetic chemical bonds between carbon atoms pulled from the air. Those bonds build glucose. Glucose builds cellulose. Cellulose builds wood. Electromagnetic energy becomes solid matter. That's not a simplified version. That's what's happening. Now take that and follow it one step further, because it doesn't stop at trees. You eat food. That food is mostly plants, or animals that ate plants, or animals that ate animals that ate plants. Every calorie you've ever consumed traces back to something that grew by pulling carbon out of the air. Which means the carbon in your muscles, your bones, your brain, the carbon in every cell in your body right now, that carbon was atmospheric CO2 not that long ago. You are not made of earth. You are not made of water. You are made of rearranged air, stitched together by electromagnetic bonds and powered by ancient sunlight. Every carbon atom in your body has a history. It floated in the atmosphere as CO2. A plant pulled it in, stripped it out, and built it into glucose. Something ate that plant. Something else ate that. Eventually, the carbon ended up in your food, then in your body, forming the molecules that make you, physically, you. And before it was in the atmosphere, that carbon was in some other organism, which died and decomposed, releasing it back as CO2 to float free until the next plant grabbed it. Carbon has been cycling through living things and the atmosphere for billions of years. You are a temporary arrangement of atoms that have been part of countless other things before you and will be part of countless other things after. That's not philosophy. That's chemistry. Feynman used to talk about how a flower doesn't lose its beauty when you understand its biology. It gains something. Knowing what's actually happening doesn't flatten the experience of looking at a tree. It deepens it. Because now when you look at an oak, you're not seeing dirt that somehow stood up and grew bark. You're seeing hundreds of years of sunlight made solid. You're seeing electromagnetic energy captured from a star 93 million miles away, used to forge chemical bonds between carbon atoms pulled from thin air, stacked atom by atom into something you can climb and carve and sit under. The tree isn't drawing from the earth. The tree is drawing from the sky, from the sun, from the air itself. And you, standing next to it, looking up at it, you are the same process. Different arrangement, same mechanism. Sunlight captured, carbon bonded, matter built. You and the tree are running the same fundamental trick, just in different directions. If you want to keep seeing the world for what it actually is, not what it looks like, subscribe.